Hello, good morning. Welcome to the BBMRI ELSI webinar, completing the ethics self-assessment for H2020 proposals. This is an introduction. So my colleague Jazz Grevel our ELSI service officer, will present this webinar. Thank you, Jazz.
Great, thank you so much, Viri. So welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. I'd briefly like to introduce both the webinar and also the series that we're actually launching at the moment. We've been working very closely with the ethics and research integrity sector at DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. And the idea is that the webinar series that it will focus on, as you can tell, completing the ethics self-assessment for Horizon 2020 proposals. And I'm sure that you will already be aware, but completing the ethics self-assessment is actually compulsory when you submit your proposals. So it is important. And with the series, we would like to essentially provide practical guidance and input when it comes to completing the ethics component of these proposals. And in future webinars, you'll be hearing from a policy officer from actually the ethics and research integrity sector, who will be giving input from the European Commission perspective, and also some experienced reviewers on specific ELSI topics that you're required to address when it comes to completing your proposals. So today I'm just going to be giving very much an introduction, and I'll give you a brief overview of what we're covering today. You'll see that I'm not actually going to be going through the specifics of a particular ELSI issue. Today is more about introducing what the ethics self-assessment is and what it comprises of, how to perhaps go about completing the ethics section, resources that you can turn to, and also what we can do here at BBMRI ERIC and how we can help. So I'm just going to start by giving an overview of the ethics self-assessment. So you're seeing two screenshots here. Again, you'll most likely be familiar with these. The first on the left-hand side is the ethics issue table, which is in part A, so the administrative forms. And the second is on the right-hand side is the ethics section, which is in the template for the project proposal, which is in part B. And both of these actually need to be completed when you're submitting your final proposal. And when it comes to completing the ethics self-assessment, whilst you're in the preparation phase of the proposal, I would say broadly there are the three things that you need to be doing. The first one, as I mentioned, is the ethics issue table, and this is where you're identifying all potential ethical issues that may or are likely to come up within your research proposal. And as I mentioned before, that's in part A. And the second thing that you should be ensuring is to make sure that the proposal itself, the project itself, is properly equipped to handle all of these ethical aspects that may be arising. And this is then something that should be incorporated into the main body of the proposal itself. So it's not simply about doing a tick box exercise in the table, but also ensuring that the project has, for example, the proper governance structures and mechanisms in place so it can handle any arising ethical issues. And lastly, which again I've mentioned before, is then you have the ethics section. So where anything has been ticked yes in the table, part A, then in part B, which is the ethics section, this is where you will be explaining and providing more information as to how that particular issue is going to be handled. So just to show you the table once more in more detail and exactly what it comprises of. Right, again, screenshots. You'll see on the left-hand side, there are essentially 11 ethics issues that are listed in this table, and within for each of these 11 issues, you have specific questions, and again, you can see that in the table template itself on the right-hand side. And what you're essentially required to do for Part A is very simple. It's a yay or nay exercise, and if it is a yes and that particular ethical issue is relevant, you should be stating the page number or numbers. And this is also where I would like to mention that the reviewers are extremely experienced and they really won't miss a beat. So if there is something that should have been ticked and it hasn't been, they will actually flag it. So it's very important that applicants, when they're completing the proposal, that they're doing their homework themselves and they're identifying all relevant issues. And of course, if anything has been ticked yes, you need to expand more fully in the ethics section. And you're going to be providing more information here. So when it comes to completing the ethics self-assessment, there are a few things that I'd like to mention, which may seem rather obvious actually, but they actually do get overlooked an awful lot. And these are timing and getting the right expertise on board. Time and time again, what we're actually seeing from our side is that ethics is something that nobody wants to deal with, and it's always one of the last issues to be addressed. And we would really recommend that you make your lives as easy as possible and start thinking about ethics from the outset, and make sure that you're actually getting the right input from the very beginning so you can identify the ethical issues, think about how to address them within the proposal, and that it isn't simply a last minute add-on at the very end when everyone is in a frantic rush to make sure that they're meeting the deadline, because the reviewers can and will spot this if they feel like it hasn't been properly been addressed. And the last point that I want to make, again, somewhat obvious, but you'd be surprised, is when it comes to structuring the ethics section, so Part B, please think about having, and we would recommend you having, a very clean structure in place when it comes to drafting that section. I've had a few conversations with different reviewers, and what we'd recommend is just make it as easy as possible for them, because this works in your favor. And so a suggestion which I've had from them and which I would also recommend to you is to actually use the ethics issue table that you see in Part A as a framework for structuring Part B. So for example, you're using the 11 ethics issues listed and that I showed you before as headings. And then you can actually go through each one separately and in detail. And something that is worthwhile considering is that even if a particular ethics issue isn't relevant in your proposal, that's okay. You can actually just state it. So keep the heading and state that it's not relevant. And of course, sometimes there will be repetition, but again, that's okay. I've seen a number of ethics sections where within a particular subsection, different ethical issues are being mixed. And again, the advice and suggestions I've received is try to avoid this as much as possible, because it does make it extremely difficult to follow. And again, I'm saying this because it works in your favor if you make it easier for the reviewers to follow the section. And so when it comes to actually completing the ethics section, of course, there's the structure and then there's the content. And again, there are a few points that I'd like to make here. As I've mentioned before, if something has been ticked in the table, this is where it needs to be explained more fully. And you can do this by firstly explaining what the ethics issue is in the context of your project, how it appears in your project, and again, where it appears in the project or in the project proposal. And again, think of the reviewers here and page numbers, state the page numbers. And then, of course, consider and explain how it's going to be handled, how the ethical issue is going to be handled and addressed within the project itself. So this could be by way of governance structures and any informed consent documentation or information. And so this is where you're going to explain how it's going to be addressed. And as part of your explanation, it's not just about listing the relevant laws that apply when it comes to that particular ethical issue. It's really about demonstrating how your particular project is going to comply with any ethical and legal frameworks. So again, from experience, we've seen applicants are simply listing laws. That doesn't really do any good without going the step further and showing that your project is ready and equipped to comply with those laws and how, or any ethical frameworks, and how it's going to do so. And lastly, as I mentioned, if you do have any ethics approval or documentation, include it in the proposal and make sure that you're referencing it within the ethics section. So the other thing that is actually very helpful is a guidance document that I'll mention slightly later on. It's a guidance document released by the European Commission on actually completing the ethics self-assessment. And it provides an ethics issue checklist, again, a screenshot. And you can see from the mini preview here, it goes through each of the ethical issues, each of the 11, and it will assist you in highlighting the information that needs to be provided or the documents that should be provided, and that you're hitting all of the relevant points within the ethics section. And again, we would advise that you turn to this checklist when it comes to completing Part B. So obviously sometimes resources are helpful, and there are a number of resources that you can turn to both whilst you're preparing for the ethics self-assessment and also during the actual project itself. So I would say a key one, and again, which tends to be overlooked a lot, is your own institution. I've mentioned this earlier, it's really about making sure that you have the right expertise on board from the outset. So do turn to colleagues who have the necessary ethical expertise. There may also be dedicated departments or managers within your own organization. Look to hospital or just simply research ethics committees, ethical advisors, and even data protection officers within your institution, because they are going to be equipped to assist you when it comes to providing support from an ethical and legal perspective that's relevant for your project. So do turn to them first, and it might require some hunting, but it is extremely helpful. And as I mentioned before, I've listed the document here, the guidance document. It's called Horizon 2020 Program Guidance, how to complete your ethics self-assessment. And it actually mentions the points that I'm making on this slide, as well as the checklist that was provided, or that you saw in the previous slide as well. And that's extremely helpful and one of the most helpful resources that you can turn to. And the last thing I would mention when it comes to resources is think about the resources that you can turn to whilst the project is running. And here, an ethical advisor or an advisory board would be helpful. And their sole purpose would essentially be to assist you with ethical issues in the project and during the course of the project itself. And they can also help with putting the right structures or policies into place so that you're ready to deal with any ethical issues as and when they arise within your project. And this is particularly useful if you already know that your project is going to be ridden or not with some more complex ethics issues. For example, the involvement of minors from developing countries. I mean, that's clear that that's going to have some issues there, but even if it's not that extreme, an ethics advisor or board is always extremely helpful. And when you're mentioning this in the proposal, this is showing to the ethics reviewers that you're being proactive and that the project is ready to handle any ethical issues that are going to come up during the course of the project. So that's another point that I would make. And then there's, of course, another resource that you can turn to is us. So we have a few services on offer. I'm going to mention three and focus mainly on one of them. We've got the ELSI Help Desk Network, the ethics check, which will be more relevant in the context of today's webinar, the ELSI knowledge base, and our overall aim is to assist researchers, biobanks, and also other researchers within the biomedical science field when it comes to ethics and law. So please do go and have a look at our website. You can find out more about us here and how we work. It's constantly being updated and uploaded with more content, but I'm just going to focus on the middle column, which is services. So the first one that I mentioned was actually the ELSI knowledge base, and there's a mini preview here along with the link again. And by the way, the webinar is being recorded, and you should actually be able to get the handout as well. So this is an open access platform, and it contains templates, for example, for MTAs and DTAs, practical guidance, how-to information on particular ELSI topics, recordings of previous webinars we've had on data protection, and also we've had another one on, again, MTAs and DTAs. So again, it's constantly being updated, and this can be a useful resource for you too. If you have a particular question, if you do have a particular question, then there's actually the ELSI Help Desk Network. And the idea is, if you do have a general inquiry, please reach out to us. Again, I would recommend that you actually go on the website first, just to obtain more information. If you have a general inquiry when it comes to ELSI issues, email us. And if your question concerns regulation and ELSI practices in a specific country, what you can do is reach out to one of our colleagues and national ELSI contact points, who will be able to provide you with assistance with respect to their own legislative and ethical frameworks. And you'll see a few contacts here. This isn't the whole list. The full list can actually be provided on the website. And if the country isn't listed, then again, please do feel free to email us. So the one that's relevant in the context of today's webinar is the ethics check. And this is specifically a service for researchers who are preparing proposals for Horizon 2020. And what we do is that we essentially provide and offer initial support when it comes to the ethics self-assessment whilst you're preparing for your projects. I should say it's very much an initial input. We provide complementary support amounting to 1 hour's worth of work. And if you do require more extensive input from us, then by all means get in touch and we can come to some kind of agreement. So if you know that anybody would be interested in this or any other services, please do forward them. There is actually a checklist, a criteria in place for the ethics check. The project needs to be transnational, both in terms of the partners and samples and data being sent and received, which is mostly the case when it comes to Horizon 2020 projects. And of course, there needs to be a biobanking component. And again, if you're not sure, please reach out to us. So if you do have a question, or you know anybody else does, or who wants assistance, this is what you need to do. You need to email us, preferably with a little indication that it's to do with the ethics check. And what we ask is that you get in touch with us at least 3 weeks prior to the deadline. I know it's always a frantic rush when it comes to, well, in call season. So, but we do ask that you get in touch with us at least 3 weeks. And what we need from you is the full proposal, a completed ethics issue table in Part A, and a completed ethics section. I should highlight here that we don't complete anything for you. Again, we're here on hand to assist you and provide initial support. We can't do the work for you. Whether you have a specific question relating to the ethics self-assessment, or whether you just want an initial glance from us, that's fine, but we need to make sure that we're receiving these documents. And again, 3 weeks prior to the deadline, and if we don't receive that within the 3 weeks, then we can't guarantee that we'll be able to help, even though we would very much like to. So I hope that you found this helpful. As I mentioned, it is part 1 of an introduction, and there will be a further webinar coming up soonish, and we'll be sure to let you know when the next one is advertised, most likely in November. So yeah, that's it for today. If you have any questions for me, please fire away, but you can also, if you think of a question later, then please do email us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So yeah, that's it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Does anybody have any question, comment about the presentation? Nobody. Well, if you think about something later, you can email us. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a nice day. Bye.